This is a short video for week 7. We have two stories, both very long stories, one by James Baldwin and one by James Joyce. The two writers have almost nothing in common except that we've got two long stories. And I'm hoping by the end of this show to demonstrate to you why I put these two authors and their two works together. Here's a little bit about James Baldwin. If you look underneath the Sonny's Blues items in our Blackboard site, you'll find a much more detailed and frankly much better slideshow in there, and I'd recommend that you spend some time with that because it covers both Baldwin's life and the story in a way that this one doesn't. This is just meant to be a really short introduction. As you can see, Baldwin was raised in Harlem, was the son of a street preacher, became a street preacher himself, and then left it at a really early age, at the age of 17. He was also homosexual, and this informs a fair amount of his essay writing and some of his fiction, particularly the 1956 Giovanni's Room, a novel where it's explicitly gay characters in a gay relationship. This thing was enormously controversial for the 1950s. Baldwin moved to France in 1948 and really spent most of his life there. He died there, in fact, but he was brought back and buried in New York. Sonny's Blues is a story from kind of his middle period, if you can think of it that way. It was written in 1957, and it was published as part of a collection of short stories in 1965. Okay. Baldwin is known for both being a novelist and a polemicist, that is, a man who wrote extensively on race and the roles of African Americans in the United States. Probably his most famous book is the 1963 The Fire Next Time. It was printed as a long essay in the New Yorker over 2 issues, over 2 weeks, and then it was republished as a standalone text. This led to his being regarded as kind of a major spokesman for African Americans, particularly at the time he was writing. 1963, of course, is the year of the Great March on Washington, the year of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the year of Freedom Riders, the year of all kinds of activities that have to do with the African American community in the United States. You can see here on the other slides a tour of his other books, as well as the many other articles that he wrote as a spokesman for the African American community. Extraordinarily influential man and not without controversy. Eldridge Cleaver, who you may know as a major black activist in the 60s, wrote an essay responding to Baldwin in 1966 where he says basically Baldwin is not representative of African Americans in the United States. And this is what causes Baldwin to go back to France, stays there, and he never really comes back to the United States. Okay. I'm switching now to a very short introduction to the dead. My sense is that Sonny's Blues, I think you're going to get without a whole lot of help. Plus, there's a much better slideshow underneath the Sonny's Blues area than what this one's going to offer you. So I'm going to switch to James Joyce here just for a little bit. Ireland's a very complex place. It has been ruled by the English. Was ruled by the English for hundreds and hundreds of years up until 1922. And here I've just listed out some dates of some major events in Irish history. That the occupation by the English, as the Irish would put it, starts really in 1210, when King John, who's the son, actually the brother of Richard the Lionheart, comes to Ireland and essentially begins the long, several hundred-year occupation of the country. The Irish are not real happy about this, and they rebel back and forth for hundreds of years. After the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1609, or right about the same time, Ireland is completely subjugated, and it's considered one big place that belongs to England. They run it kind of like a colony in a way. By 1641, only 59% of the Irish own their own land. All the rest of the land is owned by the English. It's going to get worse. As we go to the next slide, you'll see that. You can also see that this level of English occupation causes an extraordinary rebellion, the Catholic Gaelic Rebellion, and this one lasts for about 8 years, and thousands of Protestants are killed. This is in a country with a population of less than 1 million, so 12,000 people is a lot. 1688, the British know this as the year of the Glorious Revolution, where the British monarchy comes back to the throne after the English Civil War. But by this time, you can see what's happened is that only 22% of Irish land is actually held by Irish Catholics. The rest of it belongs to English Protestants or Protestants who've been living in Ireland for hundreds of years. As you can see, rebellion after rebellion. Things reach a head in Easter 1916. This is during the First World War. The British put this down by hanging essentially all the conspirators. A couple of years later, they release a lot of the other fighters that are Irish. There's a long period of time between 1919 and 1921, right at the end of the First World War, where the English and the Irish fight back and forth over who's going to own Ireland. And by 1922, it ends with a treaty, and what's called the Irish Free State, or what we call Ireland or Ire, becomes its own country in 1922. This is the 3/4 or so of Ireland that is predominantly Catholic. The 6th county of Northern Ireland, or Ulster, stay out of this union and are still considered to be part of England. Up here you see British demonstrators who are trying to keep Ireland an English colony, and down here are some scenes from the Easter Rising, the 1916 Rising, where Irish nationalists take over the post office, they take over a bunch of factories and buildings and try to run the English out. It doesn't work. Where does Joyce come in? Joyce is an Irish writer who is born around the end of this period of conflict and survives until well into the Second World War. He's a major modernist writer in this period, but in the longer he writes, the more complicated his books become. Ulysses, which is a retelling in modern times of the story of Ulysses. It happens on one day in Dublin. It's sexually explicit, a little hard to follow in places, but it's fairly approachable. Finnegan's Wake, his last book, is extremely hard to follow. I read it once many, many years ago and did not understand a word. But his early work, Dubliners, which was a book of short stories, that he writes about people he knew in Dublin when he was growing up. And his first book, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, explains kind of his growth as a writer. It's a fictionalized account. It stars a man named Stephen Dedalus, who's a kind of a stand-in for Joyce, maybe the Joyce that Joyce would have liked to have been. The Dead, the story that we're reading, is the longest story in Dubliners. It's set in about 1905. It was written in 1907. It was first published as part of Dubliners in 1914. The story, The Dead, may be tough for you to understand because there's a lot of sort of Irish commentary in it, a lot of Irish history, a little bit of religion, and Joyce doesn't use quotation marks to indicate who's speaking. He uses dashes, and this may drive you crazy. The story is set on the Feast of Epiphany, which, as you can see, is the end of the 12 days of Christmas. It's when the Magi, the three kings, arrive, traditionally. Basically, what happens, two older women, two aunts, the Mrs. Morcan, hold a Christmas party, or a New Year's party, I guess you could think of it, on this date, and they invite a big mix of family and they mix friends. Here's the real house. You can still go visit it. It's on 15 Usher's Island in Dublin, and you can see it's got buildings on either side of it. The Morcan sisters rented the upstairs, so this would have been where they were. The downstairs belonged to a corn factor, a corn dealer, so he would have had this part of the house. Over here, this is an image from the period of early 1900s of the park that Gabriel mentions in the short story that he sees the snow fill up. So it might just give you an idea of what this period looks like. Here's the main characters. Gabriel is the male. He's the nephew of the two Morcan sisters, and his wife is named Greta. She's a country girl. Gabriel's mother didn't like her very much, but the aunts love her a great deal. And they're actually a pretty fun group of people. Both the aunts, I think, are a riot in the story. They're just two old crazy ladies who are wonderfully musical and interesting. They have a niece named Mary Jane, and she is a music teacher, and she has students who come to this party as well. Lily is the maid. She's actually the first person we meet in the house. She's the one who answers the door and greets Gabriel and his wife. She also gets into a little bit of an argument with Gabriel, and you find out there's a pattern in the story of Gabriel being unsuccessful in his relationships with women. We'll see that later with the next woman we meet, Molly Ivers, and both Molly and Gabriel are professors at University College. We're not sure exactly what they teach. My sense is that Gabriel's a literature teacher, but I don't know what Molly Ivers teaches. And she's a real Irish patriot. She's on the side of becoming independent from England, whereas Gabriel is more in the middle and would prefer to stay out of politics if he can. You'll meet a Mr. Brown in the story. He's an older man who's sort of a friend of Gabriel's. although I'm not really sure if he is or not, but he's just sort of there. And he's interesting because he's a Protestant. Everybody else in the story is Catholic. Freddie Malins is an alcoholic. Everybody in the story is worried about him drinking too much. He comes with his mother, and his mother's made him take the pledge that he's not going to drink anymore, but it doesn't seem to be working very well. And we also meet a man named Bartel d'Arcy, who's a retired tenor. He's a singer, and he's actually based on a real person, as are almost all the people in the story. And at one point in the story, he sings pretty much as everybody's leaving, but he says his voice is shot and he really can't keep up. There's about 4 or 5 other named characters in the story, but almost all of those are women, and almost all of them are students of Mary Jane. So you really don't have to worry about them very much. But there's a lot of people to meet. But don't be confused by that. The people to keep your eye on are Gabriel and Greta, Kate and Julia, the debate that Gabriel has while they're dancing with Molly Ivors, and maybe Bartel d'Arcy. And the rest of the folks are really kind of in the background. They're not as important. Down here, by the way, you see a couple of scenes from the film that I've put in here. I've got a link to the 1987 John Huston movie of the short story. It stars Angelica Houston, who's his daughter. Over here is Greta. And there's an Irish actor whose name just popped right out of my head. I apologize. Who plays her husband, Gabriel. It's filmed in the actual house where the story takes place, so you get an idea of the period decorations and how people dressed, how they acted, kind of what they talked about, what they were like. So I would recommend that you watch the film as well as read the story. I would probably read the story first, then watch the movie, then go back and look at the story again and see what you get. But there's some real conflicts in here. Gabriel he's kind of a pretentious intellectual sort of guy. He looks to the continent, he looks to Europe, he looks to Britain for literary inspiration. He's really concerned at the beginning of the story that he's going to quote a British poet, and he feels like he's going to be over the heads of the all-Irish audience. That bothers him, but not enough to make him change his mind until the very last minute. There's a dance in there where his partner is Miss Ivors, and she accuses him of being more English than Irish. She calls him a West Briton, and this is a term of disrespect, and it makes Gabriel feel really bad. You'll also see a long discussion in here of what Catholics do and what Protestants do and how important the Pope is, and there's a whole bunch of other stories in here, but those aren't not quite as important. The struggle for Irish freedom and the differences between Protestants and Catholics are the major events that are kind of going on around what is essentially a family gathering, a gathering of family and friends at Christmas time, where these outside influences come into the story, but they don't really animate it, except really in the case of Miss Ivors, I think. The real story here is what's going on between Gabriel and Greta. They have an extraordinarily complicated relationship, one that seems very loving and honest and open on the one hand, but one where Gabriel and Greta seem to talk past each other. And I'll be interested to see when we get to the discussion board prompts over the next week or so what you all think. It's a long story. In fact, this is a week of 2 long stories, and I hope that you don't find the work burdensome. These are, I think, 2 of the most remarkable short stories ever written, but they are challenging in terms of their length, and I'm hoping that you'll take the time to savor them, I guess, as you go along, and don't just regard this as something you can read, answer a quiz, do discussion board, and then move on to something else. They bear a tremendous amount of attention. So we'll see how we do.